welcome to the second episode in our four-part series on sustainability, what is important in Africa. Quite often when we think about climate change, we think about the risks associated with climate change, as well as the part that we need to play both as individuals and as companies to curb the impact of climate change. Today, I'm really excited to be joined in studio by Matt Muller. Matt is a specialist in climate strategy at PwC, and today I'll be chatting to Matt about climate adaptation. Matt, thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Okay. Matt, to start, maybe let's just explore a little bit around this concept of climate adaptability. So what exactly is it?
It's a great question. And when we often think about climate change, we start with mitigation. So that's reducing our impact on the climate. This focuses a lot on net zero, carbon neutral. So really, how do we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? But even if we were to stop all of those today, we will still feel, and we are feeling, the impacts of climate at the moment, and we'll continue to feel those into the future. So really what we want to understand is, with a changing climate, how does that affect us as society, as business, as people? And this tends to manifest in two ways. The first being physical risk, which I think everyone's kind of familiar with. It's seen in terms of the increasing floods like we had in KZN, the droughts that we had in Cape Town on day zero. The magnitude and the frequency of those is going to increase over time. But the other consideration then is around transition risks. So as the world moves towards a greener economy, what are the risks to businesses, to society from that? So if I'm a coal company or oil and gas company, do I have a business in the future? Are people going to buy from me? If I'm a steel producer, are there regulations that are going to come and impact the amount of carbon embedded in my steel? So these are considerations that business need to take from both angles. And when we talk about climate risk, the key consideration is that this is not a new form of a risk necessarily. It's a risk multiplier. It takes our existing risks, whether it's liquidity, asset integrity, and really what it does is it multiplies the likelihood and impact of existing risks happening. So what we try to do is, we know we can't eliminate these risks in the future, but really the adaptation side is around how do we start to build the resilience within systems, within companies, to make them more resilient to these impacts in the future.
Mm-hmm. And I think when you're talking about adaptation and resilience from a global context is extremely important. We're seeing globally a lot of companies, moving towards that direction. But let's bring it back a bit closer to home, and from an African perspective, how important is this for businesses in Africa?
Vital. Let's just start there. I think when we look at the risks that are going to happen in the future, we know that they're not going to be linear across the world. So they're not going to be the same everywhere. So while the world is aiming for 1.5 degrees, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we know that some places are going to warm more than others. Africa and sub-Saharan Africa is one of those. So we know that warming in sub-Saharan Africa is going to happen at twice the global rate. So even if the world is able to achieve global warming of only 1.5 degrees, Africa will see it at 3 degrees. So this is significant in terms of the amount of impacts we will feel within this continent. And I think another key consideration is, not only are we going to feel the impacts more, we already have a low adaptive capacity. So we've got a relatively poor population, a relatively young population. It's a growing population, and we're trying to lift a lot of people out of poverty, build infrastructure, build economies. And climate change is just going to threaten that more and more. And we've seen this in terms of, if we just look at the insured, the population that's insured against catastrophic events. In Africa, it's only 3%. And that's out of Africa having an 18% population, contribution to the population of the world. So this is significant. It means already, if we feel the shocks, we're going to struggle to, just from an insurance perspective, to survive them, let alone can insurers actually survive and fund these changes in the future.
Okay. Yeah, I think one thing that really stands out for me there is when you say 3 degrees in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, that's quite significant. So climate change is obviously something not that can be eliminated, but I know you mentioned earlier that maybe companies can reduce that risk. Can you give us some advice in terms of some of the practical steps or some practical tips for companies on how they go about sort of minimizing the impact on their businesses?
Definitely. So I want to say that while climate change is not new, some of the processes are not new to businesses in terms of reducing these risks. If we look at transition risk, for example, companies have already had to think through what are the threats to my business from changing regulation, from changing technology, from changing markets. It's a natural thought process as in a business when developing their 5-year strategies, their 10-year strategies. All that they need to do now is just approach this with a new lens. So saying, what are the potential implications from a climate perspective on my business from a changing thing? Are consumers going to want lower carbon products? Are regulations going to change that are going to force me into a specific way or make my price less competitive? These are the considerations. So companies are already thinking about that. From a physical risk perspective, there's been a lot of work in developing the data sets required to understand the risks to physical assets. So whether it's buildings, plants, roads, there's been a lot of work around those data sets to the point that now we have data sets that can show you on 100 square meters, what are the potential hazards for that 100 square meters across the globe over the next 10, 20, 50 years. So that gives us a very good resolution in terms of what we want to look for in terms of understanding the risk at that level. What it does is it creates a bit of confusion as well. And so this is where companies need to think about how then do we take that information of there's going to be more floods in that area and use that. So one example is when PwC did this at a global scale, we looked at our offices across the globe and we said, what are the key, or how are the risks going to manifest in the future? And one example was we looked at one office and it said the flood risk is very low at that office. And we thought, okay, that's great. But when we started to look wider than that, we realized that office is sitting on a hill. Now, what that means is on top of that hill, the flood risk is low, but the surrounding environment is going to experience more floods. And so the key consideration then is around the value chain. And how then are our employees, as PwC, for example, able to get to the office to be able to service clients, those considerations. So that's what we want to start doing. And if we take another example, if let's use a steel mill in South Africa, and I'm reliant on goods and services from the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal is currently fed by water from surrounding lakes. At the moment, there's been a lack of rainfall in that area, so they actually don't have enough water to flood the Panama Canal to move the cargo through. That's a major supply route. So this can have fundamental impacts on businesses in South Africa, and this is the interconnected nature we need to think about. So as a business, we need to understand both the impacts to our own locations as well as within our broader supply chain. And that's very difficult, but there's a lot of work that's going into that.
And I think, Matt, there's some very interesting points, and thank you for sharing that. And I think, quite often when we think about climate change, we think about the risks associated with climate change. And what I want to do is look a little bit more on the opposite end of the spectrum. And are there any opportunities for companies as it relates to climate change and climate adaptation?
I'm so glad you asked the question because it can be all doom and gloom, and we don't want it to be that. So the opportunities, where there's a challenge, a risk, I always say there's an opportunity for business to solve something. So where there's a risk, there's an opportunity. The most obvious opportunity lies in if you can reduce your risk, you're improving business resilience to be able to act into the future. There's a lot of other opportunities we could look at. So we've seen it from a services perspective. How then do we translate and improve data and understanding around climate change? Can we bring AI into this to really help us infer better? We know the weather gets it wrong on a day-to-day basis. So how do we do that over 50 years? There's a lot of work that still needs to be done in terms of that. From a financing perspective, there's a lot going in there. I think there's opportunity because we see from global financing at this point in time, only 30% goes towards risk and adaptation. And there's a big call for that to be equal in terms of the amount that's going into mitigation. So not that mitigation needs to be less, but that there needs to be the same amount. And with that will come new funding opportunities for business trying to invest in this space. And then I think from a technological perspective, there's lots of opportunity. The world's going to get warmer. There's going to be more events. So we're going to need technologies to help us live in that. Whether it's air cons, sea walls to prevent flooding. These are all technologies that are going to need to be developed. And the key thing here is that it needs to be a win-win opportunity, because we don't want to go and install air cons or a seawall that then increases our carbon footprint, for example. So we use more energy for the air con, therefore we contribute more to climate change, therefore we need more air cons. It's a vicious cycle. So we need to find the win-wins, and that's a huge opportunity for business. The last thing I just want to say is really the biggest opportunity that I see is that we know climate change is happening. And that for business is a massive, not red flag, but opportunity, in that we can plan for it. We don't know when the next economic crisis is coming. We don't know if another pandemic is coming and when, but we know the climate crisis is happening. So that in itself is an opportunity for business to take action and actually start to work and really build these adaptation plans within it.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt, for that. Thank you for sharing those valuable insights as well. I love how you've made it so practical and given practical tips on what companies need to do to actually implement this, and a really important topic and something that we must think about, something that companies have to take into account on a day-to-day basis. And I'm really glad we got the opportunity to chat today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Saaleha.
Okay. It's clear from chatting to Matt that climate adaptation is an ongoing process and an essential part for companies to take into account in order to remain climate resilient. It's also quite evident from chatting to Matt that we shouldn't only look at it from a risk perspective, but that there are opportunities for companies as well to create value through their climate adaptation plans and strategies. Please be sure to join us for the next episode in the sustainability series, which covers social cohesion. And thank you very much for joining us today. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.